Welcome to Access Europe, the first meeting for 2026, and it's good that we've got a very high attendance already. And today's presenter, Neil Sargent, many of you will know him by name. He's a regular visitor at Access Europe meetings. He's from South Wales, which, if it's possible, is an even more remote area than where I live. And his topic today is new style message boxes in Access, spotting the difference between what he's done and the Access ones. And that title gives you a clue that although we've had various presentations about enhancing the functionality of message boxes, including my own attention-seeking database, Kevin Bell's task dialogue messages, we've had Access Europe sessions by Olaf Nuring in 2024 and by Marcus Dieterle back in October of last year. But unlike each of those, this session isn't just about creating more modern and attractive message boxes like those demonstrated by the people I've mentioned earlier, though indirectly Neil will be doing that as well. His purpose is totally different. He's trying to replicate the new style Access message boxes using his own VBA message box function and the steps that he's had to go through in order to actually make that all happen. So there's an example of what the new style message boxes look like on the screen on the left there now. Neil, would you like to now share your screen and introduce yourself properly? Welcome.
Okay, very briefly, I'm Neil Sargent. I've been working on Access for the last 25 plus years. I run my own small business and work for small and medium enterprises doing Access solutions. Simple as that, really. Access VBA specialist, very dedicated to it. Done databases all my life. In my Access databases, there is a problem that came up during last year. And I've always used my own message boxes using a standard VBA message box. And the reason for that is that I choose to design my interfaces to be as blended in with Access as possible. I use the standard Office theme, which is the old Office 2013 to 16 theme, which is the sort of bluish theme. And I put up my message box using VBA message box. So I was a bit shocked when spring last year, all of a sudden, Access started sending out bright red message boxes about twice the size of their predecessors. And all of a sudden, my interface, which is always blended in, no longer blended in with Access. So they use their message boxes to give you about errors and warnings about record changes, document deletions, and action queries. I've always allowed those warnings to come through. I find them useful as a developer because if the user is about to delete a record, why not let Access built-in message box tell the user, hang on, you're about to delete a record, rather than having to put code in of my own to do so. So I've always just left those warnings on and let them be displayed. So then what happens is that if I put up my own dialog boxes and Access dialog boxes, they used to look okay because they both use VBA message box. And then in the spring, all of a sudden, they no longer look okay. You've got this incongruous UI where it changes. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly demonstrate that with a very contrived example that I've put in here. I've created this little form here called del confirm. And it's literally just a little form which mixes a combination of my own warnings and the standard Access one. So I might come along in my application and say, oh, this operation's about to go and zap some data. Are you sure that you really want to do that? And if they go ahead and say yes, then I let Access tell me, oh, you're about to delete a record. And then once they've finished it, I say, well, told you so, shouldn't have done that. But all of a sudden, my message boxes are coming up completely different to the Access ones. And that was a problem to me. So I hope that Access were going to release their code so that we could use their message box, but that hasn't happened. There's no indication that it's going to happen. So I decided that I'd have to make my own message box function. And the objective is to blend in with Access, not to enhance it, not to make it any different or better, just to try and subtly blend in with it. So that's where my whole angle has come from. So just a quick mention of the history of Access and message boxes. As I said, the earlier versions, right back to 97, has always used the standard VBA message box structure. But Access has always used a custom format, which the other Office applications don't. They put a bold line under the title above the icon, and then the rest of the message. And none of the other Office apps do that. It's an Access specific thing. And in fact, there's an undocumented feature that you can exploit that by calling message box through the eval statement, and it uses accesses message box rather than VBAs. And as a result of that, you can get a message box which actually looks like the access one. Trouble is, they stopped maintaining it when Windows' own message box changed. The access one didn't. So I think it was probably Windows ME or Windows 10 where they changed the look and feel of the VBA message box, and the access one now looked different to the VBA one. So that in itself was a problem. So I'll just quickly demonstrate that. We can actually do that eval message box ourselves by literally, we go into one of these things and go to the delete record. In VBA, that would look like this, where you just say you're about to delete a record and everything is all on one block of text. But the access custom message box gives you a bold first line, and you can do that by putting at characters in the text and then calling eval. So that is an option to me because that no longer looks like access and hasn't actually looked like access for a while. So this is what forced me into developing my own system. The way that I've chosen to do that, if you imagine I've got all these applications and they're scattered with calls to message box. All my error handling uses message box. All my prompts to the user saying, okay, cancel, they all use the message box. So rather than go and search and replace in all my applications the message box function with my own special custom message box, what we can do is we can actually override VBA's own function directly. Access treats calls to its VBA functions just as standard function calls. So if you call a VBA function, any of them, format, message box, input box, any of those, it first looks in the current database for the function. And if it doesn't find it, it goes to the references and looks through all the reference libraries in the order they're defined. Well, the VBA library is mandatory. It has to be there. You can't remove it. And it always is in the first position. So it always goes to VBA first. So if you define a function in your own application that's got the same name as a VBA function, it overrides it. And it's the application will use your function instead of the standard access one. You have to use this very carefully because you're actually changing the behavior of VBA itself. It even changes what happens to queries. So if you call a query that uses an access function and you replace it with your own function, then your replacement function replaces it. Now that's very, very powerful technique. I've used it widely for many years for two purposes, and only two, because I don't want to overdo it. One of those is the round function in VBA. You're probably familiar. It does a thing called bankers rounding, where it rounds to the nearest even number. It's something to do with making roundings cancel each other when you work with huge numbers. No one else in the world uses bankers rounding except for bankers at Microsoft Access, and we know what we think of bankers. So instead, I changed it to use the schoolbook rounding. I call it schoolbook rounding. It's what we were taught at school. Basically, if it's greater than half, you round it up. Otherwise, you round it down. And what I've done is I've replaced the VBA round function with schoolbook rounding so that my customers don't keep saying, why is your rounding function rounding so odd? And just by putting round in and using the same function name as VBA, I've overridden the behavior throughout all my Access applications. And then I've done the same thing with message box. I only did this a couple of years ago. The reason that I did it was that in my code, when you call message box, you have to specify the title or it will use Microsoft Access. And part of this, trying to make it look like Microsoft Access, I wanted to put my database name in the title. And I couldn't be bothered to actually call it with the third parameter all the time. So I overrode the function and by default put the database name in the title parameter. So all my code, which doesn't bother to put in a title, puts in the correct title. Here's the actual code. This is the code that I've already had and used for a couple of years with MessageBox. And what we do is we have to declare it with exactly the same name and types of parameters as it's done in VBA and the same return result. As soon as we do that and include that function in our database, any call to MessageBox anywhere in the database will use this instead of the standard VBA one. And that's the technique we're going to use to actually replace the behavior with my new Access style dialog box. As I said, on my existing code, it basically goes off and it looks for the database AppTitle property, which is the database name. I've got an on-arrow resume next in case it's not defined. So what I'm doing is saying if the title, optional title, is blank, so the caller hasn't actually defined a title, then use the database name as a default. I've also got a timeout function in there. What I've actually got is I've got another version of MsgBox which uses the API to actually call the standard Windows MsgBox function, but with a timeout applied, so that if the user doesn't answer within the timeout period, it goes for the default option. So what I can do is I can set a global variable to set a timeout, and it uses that timed version of MsgBox instead. So they're the two things that I've done with it. And now what I'm going to do, or what I have done now, is replace this with a call to my new MsgBox function, which will actually mimic the standard access one with the bright red colors. What compatibility issues does that raise? Well, we have to actually put it in a way that's backwards compatible. So I've got 20 years worth of applications out in the field, and I'm going to change those applications to use a new MsgBox format. I need to make sure that all those historical applications are going to not break when I change my MsgBox function. So I need to serve all the existing parameters, and I also need to make sure that it works with any strings that are defined in the existing code. I'm also concerned about forwards compatibility because VBA MsgBox is so fundamental and omnipresent in my applications. I need to make sure that if Access do change things again and I want to behave in a different way, or Access themselves actually give us a MsgBox which makes this work all redundant, then I want to be able to pluck it back out again without having committed to using my new style MsgBox. Now, if I'm going to do that, I've got to make sure that it doesn't do anything new, or if it does anything new, that my applications aren't dependent upon it. I could add optional parameters, so I could add another parameter, like a timeout parameter, for example. And what that would do is it would apply a timeout. But if I've got an application in the field that relies on it, and the new MsgBox comes along which doesn't do timeouts, then I won't be able to basically undo the override. I could interpret existing parameters in a different way. And in fact, I break these rules, and I do actually do that in a certain way, as you'll see later on. But I need to do it in a way which is forwards compatible. And I could add some new features, like I could add in hyperlinks and help boxes and extra buttons that do things. But then what I'm doing, I'm deviating from my original plan. I'm creating a new kind of MsgBox, which has new features, which my application would then rely on. So any changes I make are a one-way trip. My objective is to not invest heavily in those new features so that I create myself a maintenance nightmare in 5 years' time when they decide to do MsgBox a different way. Let's have a quick look at what I've actually done with the MsgBox so far and how closely I've managed to mimic it. We're going to have a little competition, spot the difference. If anyone could see more than 4 pixels difference between my new MsgBox and the Access one, then they can have tonight's entrance fee refunded. So that's a good prize.
By the way, if you got him free, I'm going to be demanding my money back from you all.
Okay, so the first one, this is Access on the left and my MsgBox on the right. Now, I'm going to show you just how close these are. What I was going to do is I was going to bring them up on the screen, cut and paste them into a graphics program to show you the differences. But actually doing that in a live demo is a nightmare. So I'm going to actually ask you to trust me, and I'm going to do the Blue Peter trick of here's one I preferred earlier. I'll just delete that one, which is my MsgBox, and underneath is the standard Access one. So what I've done is I've called up the MsgBox, I've screen grabbed it using the snip and clip tool, and I've pasted it into Corel Draw, and I'm showing it at like a pixel level of resolution so you can see the differences. So that's the before, that's Microsoft Access, and if I then paste back in that one I just deleted, that's mine. And in fact, what I can do in Corel is I can actually apply a transparency so you can see one on top of the other. And if I bring mine forward or take it back, you can see that there are very few differences. Now that became a bit obsessive doing that because I wanted to make it exactly the same. But fortunately, it wasn't as hard as you might think because, surprise, surprise, the Access MsgBox is just written with standard fonts, standard spacings. I suspect it's actually implemented as an Access form, so, or certainly in a similar way. Mimicking it, I've managed, but boy, was it a journey to get there. And that's what I want to show you because the hoops I've had to jump through to achieve such a close mimic are quite considerable and certainly not what we expected when we started doing this. So spot the difference number 2. You can see this is what happens when you go to save a table in Access. And the difference between this and the previous one is that I'll just go between those. If you look, we've got multiple lines next to the icon. If that's reduced to a single line, then it actually gets centered on that icon. So this actual line here, the line of text, do you want to save the table now, is now centered on the icon. It's actually been shifted to make it look more balanced. And this is another one of the examples of the differences. And the differences between these and are very similar to a pixel level to what I just showed you on the other one. Okay, so in order to actually achieve this comparison, I needed to make sure the icons look good. You can pick up some icons which sort of look like the right Office icons quite easily. I could have screen grabbed them. I could actually have screen grabbed them off Access, saved them as bitmaps and used those. But the trouble is, what I found was Access doesn't actually use the question mark icon, doesn't use the critical icon very often either. It's not something I'm familiar with because I try to avoid it. And so actually screen dragging them is difficult. And in fact, the question mark icon, you might not realize, but the guidelines for Microsoft Office say that you shouldn't present an icon which duplicates the message that it's conveying. Now, if you think about it, if you're asking a question, you shouldn't show a question mark icon. And what I found was that Office, in general, doesn't ask questions with the question mark icons. It puts up the information icon. So actually nabbing them off Access wasn't a very easy option. So I tried to actually go and get the icons out of the Microsoft Office files with Resource Hacker and things like that. And then I discovered that they're no longer bitmaps. They're no longer icons. The new Office interface now uses vector drawings for all its iconography. And those vectors are stored somewhere in the code. They're not stored as bitmaps like they used to be, and they can't be hacked out. So that came as a bit of a surprise. Note also that the old icons, if you look at the warning icon, it's a bit different to the old ones. And in fact, Access have provided their own custom icon. That exclamation mark is different in Access to other Windows applications. I don't know why they've done it and why they've broken their own rules. I suspect it's a historical reason that they made it look like that for a reason. They've retained their custom icon. So that one, I actually did grab a screen grab. That's the only way I could actually exactly mimic that pixel by pixel. As I said, they're stored as vectors. The other thing is they're now 28 pixels. There used to be 32. Everyone knows that icons are 32 pixels. There used to be 16, which were unreadable, but they've been 32 for years, what Microsoft actually called the large icon size, even though they've now used extra large and bigger pixel sizes. And now icons are actually standard size of 28 pixels. Now, I thought that was because they're vectors. And if you think about it, if you draw a circle 28 pixels wide and then you anti-alias it, it's going to spill either side of the borders and get a bit wider. And I thought that was why. But I've since seen that in the standards, it's actually because it's more to do with the way they do their modern application interfaces. They want to do everything in borders of 8 so that things line and go better together. So I hadn't realized it, but the new icons are now only 28 pixels wide. This is all described at this link on Microsoft, talking about Microsoft iconography. It tells you all the standards and how these user interfaces are designed. And the great thing about it is you can also download all the icons from Microsoft, from GitHub. They've published all the icons and they've published each one in 16, 20, 24, 28, 48, and 128 pixel resolution or something. I say resolution, but in fact, they're vectors, so the resolution doesn't apply. But what I found was that with vectors, you have to align them to pixel boundaries. Otherwise, when you anti-alias them, make them actually into pictures, they all get blurred if you don't precisely do it. So they're all tweaked and optimized, and they're available. And it's not a massive download. It's 134 megabytes, but there's 140,000 files in it. And when I tried to unzip it, it took over 20 minutes on my machine. So it's a big file. And the other thing about it is that they've got weird names, like you would expect the exclamation mark to be called exclamation or alert, but it isn't. It's called something else. And so you have to have a bit of a guesswork on what they call them. But I found the 3 that I wanted, and the 4 that I wanted, and found that then I found that Access wasn't using it. Just a tip about that. I was saying about the anti-aliasing effect on these. What I suggest is that if you want your icons to look good and crisp, don't get a big icon and set the zoom control or the zoom property on the image box to zoom, because what that does is it takes the bitmap that you've given it, even if it's 128 or 256 pixel bitmap, and it re-samples it down to 32 or 28 pixels. So the original thing has got anti-aliasing, and then you anti-alias the anti-aliasing, and you end up with a blurred mess. It's much better to take a proper 28 pixel image and show it clipped rather than zoomed. And you'll get a better result if you do that. And I can show you that. I've got a form on here which will actually show us that, form icons. So here what I've done is I've downloaded the bigger icons, the sort of which default to like a 72 pixel icon. And you can see they're nice and round and crisp. If you look at those, when I put them in a zoomed image box, you can see a certain amount of blurring around them. And if instead you take a proper 28 pixel icon and show it unzoomed, you get a better image. I'm just going to zoom in on that so you can see how it looks. If we look at those, you can actually see, can you see on the left, there's a certain amount of raggedness around the icons. And if you look at the information, the eye, you can see it's really badly anti-aliased on the left-hand side, whereas it's nice and crisp on the right-hand side. So I know you're talking to a perfectionist here, but these things I think matter if you're trying to actually put a professional interface, and it's a very simple tip. Don't double anti-alias is the answer. Now, the other thing is that the message boxes that we have, they actually beep when you open them. Apparently, Colin isn't subject to this because it irritates him so much he's switched them all off. But I didn't realize, but the actual beep that the message box made is directly related to the icon, not the function, not the name of the message box or whatever. It's the icon which determines which beep gets used. And which beep is associated with which icon is configured in the sounds control panel. So the exclamation mark and the information mark that both use the sort of, I think it's the asterisk sound, which goes bing, and the critical one is a different sound, which goes bing, because it's a bit more obvious. And funnily enough, the question one has got no sound at all. I'll just go and show you these. And for this, I'm just going to quickly stop sharing because I've got to share with sound so you can hear the irritating sounds.
Right, yeah, I turned off beeps a long time ago. Anyway, back to you, Neil.
Okay, with a bit of luck, you should be able to hear these now. So I've got a little hello world here. So each of these have got a different icon. Sorry, I didn't introduce this demo form, this message box demo, which is the main form in the database. And this database is going to be supplied at the end and downloaded from Colin's website. But what this form does is it takes the message box parameters and allows you to specify which parameters you want, which icon you want, what the default button is, and help file. So for each of these columns, you've got the prompt, the parameters of the message box title. There's a couple on there. There's the title, and the sort on the end is just for me to make sure they come out in the order I want to present them. So if we double click on one of these, we get message box. Now the irony is I didn't hear that.
I did.
The reason is because it's done the question mark first. There's no sound on a question mark. That's the exclamation mark. I'll do that again. That's the exclamation mark. Did you hear that?
Yep.
And this is the question mark. I didn't hear anything. That's the critical sound. And if you don't do an icon, you don't get any sound. So the sounds are actually configured in Windows, and you can switch them off if they irritate you as much as they irritate Colin. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing sounds now because otherwise you'll hear every beep and click that I do. So I'll just reshare again without the sounds on this time. The title parameter. If you remember my original message box replacement function, the whole purpose of it was because I was too lazy to put the title parameter in every single message box call that I do. I can never be bothered to put that in. So by defaulting it in my override, I know that it's always going to come up with the database name. So it uses the app title of the property of the database. That's set in the options for the current database. If that's not set, it uses the words Microsoft Access. And this is exactly the same behavior as Microsoft Access itself uses. By doing that, I've mimicked the access behavior for the title. Just a quick look at that. So there's the title. Here, I've overridden the title. So on this example, I've specified a title parameter over here. So when I run that, we get the title. If we get rid of that and run it, it reverts to the name of the database. And if I went into file options, I won't do it now, but if I went into file options and changed the database name in here, I won't clear it now, that would actually then use the words Microsoft Access. And that's the same behavior as Microsoft uses in its own message box. Okay, the next thing that we need to deal with is the red border that's drawn around the new access message box. If we call a form as a dialog box, Windows itself draws the border. We can't control the color of that border. It's not available. It's defined by Windows and it uses it for its own styles. You can't even call an API function to override that border, which is gray these days, but who knows what it will be in the next version of Windows. You also get the control box at the top right-hand corner here, and you get a caption and title bar. There's also a shadow. Can you see the shadow drawn around the message box? That shadow is actually drawn by Windows as part of drawing the border for the window. And again, it's out of our control and it's done by Windows, and it all depends on your aero effects and things like that, whether it appears. If we do a borderless form, then we don't get a border around it. This is where we've changed the border style to none on our form design. We don't get caption or title bar. Because we've not got a title bar, we can't drag the windows. We can't move our message box once it appears. And there's no shadow because the shadow is drawn by Windows and we haven't got a border, so it's not drawing it for us. So we can put a rectangle control and color it red, the same color as access. And we can put it around the edge of our borderless form and it will appear as if we've got a red border. So that works really well. So we can get our red border. I've only done the yellow background on here to distinguish it from the white background it's being shown against. So we'll use a white background and a red border and we'll be looking like access then. Now the way we get that border to exactly go around the edge is that we actually have to put it 1 pixel in from the left and 1 pixel down from the top and 1 pixel up from the bottom. But funnily enough, it has to be flush on the right hand side. And that's to do with the way window or access tiles its windows, so that when you put two next to each other, only one of them has got a border, the left hand border, and the right hand border effectively gets overdrawn. Or is it the other way around? It's the other way around, isn't it? Just a design tip, I don't know if you know, but if you take the actual border control, if you hit control and the arrow keys, you can actually move or nudge objects on design view, and when you do that it's moving by 1 pixel. That's what the nudge factor is. So what we do is we get our border, we draw it, and then we nudge it with control right and nudge it with control down, and then we then know it's 1 pixel from the top or 1 pixel from the bottom. The other thing you can do is in the top property in the design form you can actually put 1px, and px is a valid mention for you to put in the property, and it will translate that. You can put in pm, twips, or px. Just px I use. I can use pixel as well, Crystal. I just type 1px and it translates it into 0.104 twips or something. Okay, so we've got our borderless window, but it still can't be dragged and it's still got no shadow. How can we actually do it so we can drag the window so we can move it? Because there's nothing worse than a message box popping up on top of something that you want to look at underneath. You sometimes need to drag it out of the way so you can see what it's talking about. So this is an idea which is courtesy of Colin. He told me about this. He's got it on his website. And basically there's a simple API call which you can call on the mouse down event of your form. And what it does, it says, I'm passing control to you, Windows. You take control of my window. And Windows goes off and handles the dragging for you until the user does a mouse up event and releases the mouse, and then control comes back to the application. So it's a simple one-line call, and you can actually drag your window around. I'll show you the dragging later on, in part of the demo later on. So we've got our dragging. Now we need to worry about how we're going to get a shadow, because I want this message box to look like Windows. I want it to look not like an access form. I want it to match in with the ones that are being displayed by access. And so I've got a trick. I've created a second form, which I've called message box shadow. Although to be fair, that could be called dialog box shadow because it doesn't care if it's a message box. It could be used for any borderless form to add a shadow. It's a normal pop-up dialog form, complete with a caption, title bar, and a shadow. I give it a blank caption, space. That makes the caption disappear. You can turn off the control buttons. You can turn off that. So I can turn it into a blank form that just shows the actual outside boundary. The parent form, the message box form, gets its own act together in terms of what it's going to display while it's hidden. So it decides what buttons are going to display, where it's going to position the text, and what icon it's going to do. It does all that as a hidden form before it makes itself visible. And instead of making itself visible, it just opens this second shadow form, and it passes its own name as a parameter. So the shadow box form receives the parent form's name, and it's completely self-contained. It hooks into that form's close and resize events. It sizes and positions itself to be the same size and same position on the screen as the parent form. Then it makes itself visible. And because it's a normal dialog box, it gets drawn with the shadow. It waits for a short pause, and then it makes the parent form visible. Sorry, I've made a mistake there. It should say it then makes the parent form visible. The short pause is because effectively what you're doing is you're showing two forms, one immediately after the other, and you get this rather irritating flicker. But if you put a little pause in, it makes it look like it's sort of animated and coming out the screen. It sort of smooths it out. And what happens is the parent form has actually inherited the underlying form's shadow. So you've still got a borderless form, but there's another shadowed form lurking underneath it, and it inherits its shadow. And that's what it looks like. It's got the shadow around the outside. Now, one of the problems is that when you share your screen on Zoom, Zoom doesn't bother with all the little niceties like shadows. It actually cuts them out. So I can't show you it using Zoom screen sharing to show you this effect. So what I can do is I can turn my machine into a virtual camera, and I'll do that in a minute and show you how that works. The shadow form, if you remember, we've used Colin's trick to actually make it draggable. So what happens is that it uses its own timer event and looks at the parent's resize event and tracks any movement of the parent. So it sits there on the timer saying, are you still there? Are you still there? Are you still there? And if it sees it moves, it jumps to the new position. So it follows it around the screen. And if you do that quick enough, you can get it to work without much flicker. Because you've got to actually do that quickly, you're actually sitting in the background consuming resources. So what it does is after a second, it says, oh, I'll only look every now and then. And then when I see it move, I'll start looking while it moves. And then when it stops moving, I'll slow down again. I'll show you that throttling in a minute. And then finally, it uses the parent's on close event to actually shut itself when the parent closes. So what we've got is we've got a self-contained form. The calling form, other than asking it to appear, has nothing to do. If the form isn't defined in your database, it can't open it, so it doesn't happen. So this feature is optional, if you like. You only include it if this form exists. So let me now demonstrate that. Now to do this, I'm going to have to actually, again, stop sharing and share instead as a camera. And what you'll see is that you'll see my screen, but it's a bit more blurry because it's actually behaving as a camera rather than screen sharing in Zoom. So, but it's probably a bit blurry. Okay, so let's call up our, we'll use our delete one. Can look on the screen here. Okay. Right, what I'm going to do, instead of calling it up there, I'm going to call it from code. So here I've got a function, just a test function, which literally just calls that message box. Okay, now you can see the shadow effect, can't you? Hopefully.
Yes.
Good. Because if I now move the screen, you might see a very slight flicker.
Yes, again.
Okay, well, let me show you two things. I'll just clear that. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, if you remember, when we start out, the shadow form says, make myself visible. And if it actually doesn't put a delay in, it immediately then makes the parent form visible. And so you've got two forms open at once and they flicker, and it's annoying. You won't see the flicker on Zoom, but believe me, it's just irritating. If we put a little 200 millisecond delay in there, what happens is that the first one appears, and then just as it's appeared, the second one appears, and it looks like an animation, and it works quite well. And if we extend that out, I'll just put an extra 0 on there, save the changes, and then call my form. So this time I've extended that 200 millisecond delay out to 2 seconds. So that's what the shadow form looks like, and then my form appears on top of it, and it just is inheriting its shadow. So I'll just unmake that change it back to 200 milliseconds. So that's back to the 200 milliseconds. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the delay. You know, I said when we first start out, what happens is we set like 100 millisecond timer interval. So every 10 times a second, we're checking to see if the parent form has moved. If I extend that out, let's extend it out to a whole second, and call our message box. Okay. Now when I move the message box, it takes a second to realize that it's gone. Actually, it doesn't take a second. It takes up to a second. It might be nothing. It depends when the timer interval goes. But can you see that significant delay before it catches up? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it and then I'm going to keep moving it. So what's happened is as soon as it sees it moves, it starts doing it at 10 milliseconds. So it's looking at 10 times as, no, what's that? 100 times a second. But once it stops for more than a second, it goes back to the slow delay. Okay, but once it starts, it catches up. So what that's doing is it's throttling so that because at the moment, what's the point of sitting there checking this thing 100 times a second to see if it's moving when, quite frankly, the user doesn't move them very often. But once it moves, if we were only doing it every second, this box would be jumping out all over the place. It would go, oh, wait for me. Oh, wait for me. Oh, hang on, wait for me. Wait for me. So what we do is we have an initial moderate time, which allows us to, within a reasonable response, realize it's moving. But once it's moving, we follow it closely and then we back off. And I think that's just a sensible way of using the resources, because you've got 40 people doing this on one server. You don't want all of them sitting there hacking away on sleep timers. Okay, I'll just change that delay back, otherwise it will annoy us for the rest of the demonstration. Close that, go back, change that delay back to, so respond within 100 milliseconds, and then once you're tracking, respond within 10 milliseconds. So just check that's behaving itself now. Yeah, much more responsive. You still do get some flicker, but it's much more responsive. Okay, now I'm going to just go back to sharing my screen rather than my camera. So hopefully now, has that sharpened up again, Colin?
Yes, it has. Thank you.
Okay, you can see now it's because in order to show all those graphic effects, it needs more bandwidth, which is why things like Zoom, and in fact, remote desktop and virtual machines and all these things, they don't do everything that a native machine does, because all these things take bandwidth. So things like shadows and animations aren't usually done when you do screen sharing. So that's why I've done it with a camera. So mimicking the buttons. These buttons on the message box actually have a double border to convey both focus and default. So the red button is the default one, but the one that's got the focus is the one with the white ring round it. Standard command buttons are too thin or too thick to do that. So what I've done is I put a larger button underneath with a black border, and then a small button in the middle with a white border. The other thing I've done is when you focus on the button in Access, it gets a dotted boundary around it, which isn't what they're doing in theirs. So what I've done is when that focus happens, it actually shifts on got focus to some hidden text boxes, and those hidden text boxes then allow you to move the keyboard to switch between them. But it means that the focus, the button that we're showing, are never actually got the focus, so they don't get the dashed line around them. And I was going to explain that when I mean a hidden control, what I mean is a standard technique that I use to hold the focus from any control on the system. You have to do it if you're making a control not visible, because you can't remove the focus on a visible control, the active control. So I always have on my forms a form called hold focus. It's 0 width, standard height, transparent background and border. So what happens is it gets the focus, but you can't see it because it's only 0 width wide, and it doesn't even flicker or flash. And you can use that to park the focus while you do other things. Message box formatting. I mentioned that Access has always supported this at format to do multiple lines. Well, I'm supporting that as well, which goes beyond a VBA message box, but it means we're still sort of doing what Access does. Line 1 is the heading in the new message box above the icon, and lines 2 and 3 are the prompt. So let me just quickly show you those. This is the first line, which is used to show the bold text, and then you've got line 2 and 3. And if you show that in VBA Eval, you can see that's basically how they used to do it with their Eval method, whereas VBA can't do that extra line. It's always next to the icon. So what I've done is I've supported this format, and the top area is called a heading. I've called the heading, and the rest I've called the prompt, which is the normal area that gets used. I considered whether we could actually always use the heading for the first line of the message box, but the backward compatibility won't work with that. I've got hundreds of strings defined in there that didn't know that rule. So I can't put in a new rule which says always put the first line in a separate block, because existing strings are going to fail. They're going to come out looking wrong. So it means existing code will never use that heading line because it didn't know it was there. They'll always come out as standard messages without the extra access highlight heading line. The other thing I've done is I've supported it so you can put, it only interprets the first two @ characters. So it means you can use @ characters in the rest of the text, and it also means you can just put them together because there's no difference between an empty line 2 and a line 3 than having just going straight to line 3. It makes it much easier in code if you put the ats together. So that's what it looks like. This is what it looks like in code. So it's quite easy to actually, in your strings in your code, just define this feature to actually show the heading separately. Help and hyperlinks. Okay, I'll quickly demonstrate those because there are help in there. Basically, if you hit the question mark, it follows a hyperlink, which is what Access does with its own help these days. And you can see that's going off to the relevant text. It also supports the old CHM format. Oh, sorry, that was saying you can put any hyperlink in there. So here, what I've done is I've just used a Google search to go off and find any hyperlink. So it's just gone off and done some sort of random Google search that I've put in as a hyperlink. So you can use the hyperlink as it stands to either your own help files or to some general web searching. And it also supports the old help file system. Here's an old one that I've dug out from somewhere to show that it still actually supports the old help system. Let's move on to Textbox Resizing. This is based on original code by Stephen Lebans. If you're not familiar with Stephen Lebans, go to his site. He stopped updating it in 2009, but he's left his code up there for the better good, and it is for the better good. There is so much good stuff on there. It dates back to Access 2000, but it's all valid stuff. He uses a function called Textbox Size. I think I might have renamed it from his original function name, which uses the draw text function of the API to actually calculate the size required to draw text. I've modified it to take into account the margins and border width and scroll bars for controls. So I took his original code and extended it a bit. And I've also provided a simplified version called Textbox Growth. What this does is it actually returns the size in TWIPs that a control has got to be grown or shrunk to make it fit the text. So with a single line of code, you can actually use that to move or size the adjacent controls by the same amount. So you can actually make a text box grow, and then because you know how much it's grown, you can apply that growth to its adjacent controls to move them to match. If you're doing that, just a tip, you must always resize the form before growing so that your control doesn't bash against the edge. And you must always move the control when it's shrinking before you shrink the form, otherwise the form will get left behind. And you've got can shrink and can grow for forms. Let's have a look at the resizing. First of all, I resized the title. So this is a ridiculously long message box title that you're not likely to come across. But basically what I've done is I've looked at the title length and I've made the message box wide enough to fit it. You can increase the heading size. Here, I've got long heading with an extra paragraph in the heading, but as you can see, I've got loads of text in the heading and then a short message in the text. I can have a long prompt, so I've got a short, brief heading, which makes much more sense, and then more text. And you can see that the message box is just getting bigger to make it fit. And I can actually make it big enough for both a long heading and a long body. And in fact, it will grow until it hits 80% of the screen size. So the text box just gets bigger and bigger until it gets to 80% of the screen size before it actually runs out of space. And then having done that, if it's still run out of space, I then put the scroll bars on. So in fact, I still don't truncate the text. I just put a scroll bar on. I've got the form, so I've got the space for it. So you can actually have unlimited text in your text box and it automatically sizes to it. Now, what I'm going to do is I've got this demonstration here. I've put an Easter egg in here, which if you include the words lorem ipsum demo in the text, it will actually show you how it works. So let me just click on that. What it's doing is it's looking at the text. It's saying, make it an inch wider, make it an inch wider, make it an inch wider to see whether the text that it's got to display is going to fit. So it goes wider in inch chunks. but it doesn't go wider. It goes wider, and then it goes higher, and then it goes wider, then it goes higher. And what it does, it tracks the aspect ratio. So it maintains an aspect ratio, but it goes in chunk size pieces. It doesn't do it continuously because it means every message box you display would be a different size, whereas most messages aren't going to resize that much. So it goes in sensible size chunks, but it goes through, and I'll just run that again. Taller, 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 wider, taller, wider, taller, wider, taller, wider. Maintaining the aspect ratio as it grows. And that's what it's done in the background. It's done that in a loop and then just displayed the result. You do get some text, which basically, if it carried on getting wider, that text would get orphaned and you'd end up with a lot of white space on the right-hand side. So if it goes wider and sees it's made no difference, it stops doing it. In fact, it backtracks. And so it stops at the natural width of the text. And here's an example of an extreme version of that. There's no point in making that a full screen dialog box because all the rest of the stuff that I'd expand to would be blank space. So it reaches a natural width of the screen. The other features that I've supported is clipboard. Basically, it supports copy and paste. So if we do a Control C, then we go into Notepad, Control V, it's actually copied into the clipboard the contents of the message box. Let's just do that again with something more substantial. Control C, go into Notepad, Control V. As you can see, it's copied the content. And the final feature it's got is right to left support. So you may think that's a bit weird, but I'll just show you here. This is message box doing the same thing, VBA. I've never had to deal with right to left languages before, but basically they right justify the text and reverse the punctuation. It's so you can display right to left reading languages. But you'll see they've also even reversed the order of the boxes and left justified them. So the whole thing is actually mirrored. And I've included that really for completeness because I've never used it before and I doubt if I ever will. Okay, so that's it. That's what it does. There's only one quick subject that I'm going to mention is future prospects. What haven't I done? Well, I could put a timer in there to provide a timeout support. You know, on my existing one, I'm using that special TMsgBox function. I'd quite like to be able to continue to do that. Rich text support. Well, it would no longer be compatible with Access because they don't use rich text. What's the point of having something that comes up in purple italic 20-point font? Because it won't look like Access anymore. But you could use it to just do little subtle things like a bit of bold here and a bit of italic there, or maybe some hyperlink support. So that would be quite useful. But if you did that, I don't want to have to use a full HTML editor to actually enter the code. I want my code to be quick and easy. So you'd have to use a sort of pidgin HTML language. I've already done this. What it does is it just recognizes tags without requiring the whole body. So you could literally just put M and not M either side of something and you get a bold phrase. But to do that, you've got to split the text up. So there's challenges in the HTML. And there's text resizing challenging because the text is different size fonts. So Steve Lebans' code will no longer work. Now, I've done 90% of the work on this, but whether or not I finish it, I don't know. It depends really if people care enough and whether they want to do it. Perhaps we could have a matching input box function. Again, I don't think I would because I don't want a bright red input box function. Can you remember I said I tend to try and blend in? So my input box is going to be blue. It's going to look like a form. Not necessarily a matching input box function, although I will override the input box function in VBA, but not with one that looks like this because I want it to look like a form. And did you notice this? I did say pidgin HTML, not pigeon. And I think hopefully Marcus will understand that little joke.
Yeah, he made that comment right at the very beginning of the meeting. I meant to put it in my introduction and forgot.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Neil, thank you.
We have overrun slightly.
That's all right. I think everyone wanted to give you enough time to finish, and thank you ever so much for the amazing amount of detail you put in to your preparation for this over a period of months. There were some questions early on about parameters, but I think they've all been answered. Why you've largely stuck to what's there now so as not to break backwards compatibility. I think we can safely say, and one of the main reasons for you doing this was not just the message box itself, but the enormous amount of user interface tips that you provided, which can be used for a whole variety variety of purposes, including border positions and so on. So
Yeah, I hope that I wanted to describe the journey, not just the message box. That was really my main objective.
well, to my mind, you succeeded absolutely amazingly with this. Right, there were a number of questions all in a rush. Now, I'm going to try and summarise these. We'll start with Marcus, who asked whether you'd considered putting a shadow inside the message box, say a rectangle 10 pixels inside with a shadow around that. Had you thought of doing that?
I had thought about that, and in fact, you had suggested it and shown me an example yourself, Colin. But the problem with that is the shadow is actually translucent. It's actually put there by Windows, and it actually is a transparency on what's underneath. So it's not as simple as just building a shadow around it. It doesn't quite look right. So that's why I chose not to do that. I wanted to go for the authenticity.
Both Chris and then Jason talked about instead using a button with a shadow to provide a border, and then you wouldn't need the back shadow form. Now, I don't know if that would work.
No, because the buttons only show a cast shadow in one direction. They don't shadow all the way around. And again, it's not the arrow effect. The problem is you're trying to mimic what the actual Windows does with its own arrow effect. And I did try and experiment and investigate, and it can't be done to my levels of perfection.
Certainly you have shown amazing perfectionism in actually getting all of this done here. But also, Jason, again, an earlier question, he suggested hiding the shadow form on move and then making it visible again when it stops.
That's a good idea, probably a better idea than dragging, although it's the initial response time is still the problem rather than the dragging. Once it's dragging, it does keep up quite well.
Jason, did you want to add to anything to either of those?
Yeah, I just thought that if a box has been moved, then obviously you're not really looking at the frame behind it. You're looking at the box itself. So once you stop, then you've got a view. But no,
that's a very valid idea. I think it's a good idea.
Well, if you try that and add that feature, we can always update the file that's available from the website later.
With hindsight, it's a better idea, but it's probably not worth revisiting.
Okay. Tim Finch asked, I think he's one of these people with ultra high definition monitors on which everything looks tiny, including the font size on message boxes. He's asked whether your message box function can set the font size so that the box appears larger or large enough. Is that basically the idea, Tim?
Yes, it just looks too small on big monitors. That's, high def monitors.
I think that that's probably the Access message box is guilty of the same thing. So sins of the father, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Ben Sakarich asked whether you could add a button to allow translation of the text for those non-English speaking users.
That could be done, although adding a button is averse to my sort of forward compatibility plan. But certainly interpretive, perhaps you could actually look at the text, work out what language it is, and interpret the prompt rather than having a translate button. We could add a button for that and a button for this and a button for the other, but it was my original plan was try to avoid adding features that require visual or other differences. That's why I've only added the Control-C and the interpretation of the formatting, because they're not visible or actively different to what Access is doing.
For what it's worth, I demonstrated a nearly completed application translator back in 2023, I think it was. I actually intend to finish and release it this spring. It's 95% done, and that allows bilingual message boxes and so on. Obviously, it relies on the automatic translation of things like Google or DeepL, whatever, so it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. So Tim also reminded everyone of Olaf's enhanced message box back from 2024 covered the rich text idea, as indeed did Marcus's stuff that he showed in October. So rich text is available in different ways there. Crystal, I don't understand Neil's virtual camera or sharing screen thing either.
I can explain that one to you, Crystal. It's great for things where you actually absolutely need the animations. I can explain that to you off camera if you like.
Right, I think I've covered all of the questions. Paul, you've just put your microphone on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
If I want to use this in my application, how many forms and modules do I need to add?
There are a dozen or so modules and just 2 forms. But one of the things I was wondering about, and one of the things I was interested in, is if we want to drop this in, I was thinking that whether or not consolidate them all into a single support module might be possible. But I haven't had the time to do that for you. You'd have to do that yourself. But yeah, there are 15 modules and 3 class modules. So 18 modules and 2 forms. So it's quite chunky from that point of view.
I wouldn't say it's chunky compared to what it can do.
But the beauty of it is all those forms are just general purpose modules with conventionally or standard named functions. So you can use them for everything else. For example, the text box sizing, that text box size and text box growth functions are there, and you can use it for all your other form resizing.
Right.
Great, thank you.
I mentioned in the chat earlier when you were talking about how you manage making something invisible when it had the focus. I've got a different way of doing it, and I've said in the chat, control with a focus, you can hide it. All you need to do is disable it first. So 2 lines of code, 1, disable it, and then immediately after it, hide it. It works. You don't need to shift the focus. Yeah, click me and I disappear is the name of the web page where I discovered that a long time ago. Chris.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, just going back to using the button and shadow, I understand your comments about that, but you could do 2 buttons, one with shadow top left and one with shadow bottom right. Gives you a shadow all the way around.
Oh, that's a good idea.
That's the first thing. The other thing is also you may find the transparency of a form. I can't remember what the VBA code is for it now, but you can set a form to be slightly transparent.
Yeah. The problem is that the shadowing is not actually part of the window. It's done by what's called Windows Presentation Manager. The underlying nuts and bolts of Windows does it for you outside your form border. It's part of what they call the Chrome, actually drawing the border. So it's difficult to do that. But the other ways of trying to copy it, yeah, that doing it in both directions is a good idea.
Well, my thinking was you'd actually set the offset from top and left and so on. Maybe I don't know what it would be, but 5 bytes, or 5
Yeah.
pixels or something like
Yeah.
that, rather than being 1 pixel.
Yeah.
So the shadow forms part of the form itself.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an alternative. The difference is usually that if you actually look at it on a Windows thing, you'll see that it is actually a transparency because you can see the underlying stuff through the shadow, which you just can't achieve if you do it that way.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. The files, Neil has already provided the PowerPoint for me and also the demonstration database, so you'll be able to download those from either of the 2 links that are shown there. Neil, thank you again for what was an absolutely amazing presentation, and your development work on this was just incredible. I started trying to do something when you first raised the question and rapidly decided that it was way beyond the patience that I had to take it to completion.
I was going to put our first attempts in the first slide, but I thought we better not. We needed to save some face.
I was very pleased that you carried on with it, though, so I didn't need to, apart from anything else. But it was excellent there. So next month we have the return again of Aleksander Wojtasz. He is the person who's had by far the best viewed video of all of the nearly 50 sessions we've had so far. His first session on Gantt charts has had nearly 6,000 views, I think, now, and his second one was also very popular. So we've invited him back again, this time to talk about a completely different topic, which is using the Edge browser with control within Access to provide an advanced data grid. Please, would you like to give us a brief outline about next month's amazing presentation?
Good evening. So, session I will be presenting something new, not this time related with GD8 graphics, but rather something related with new edge control, web control, and some usage of it, how we can present data inside it, because there are examples in internet that are showing how we can make a menu that is animated, but I will use it in some different way. Maybe I will share my screen. So as you see on the screen, there is some demo form. This is some actually working form from one of my clients, but important part, we have some self-filtering forms. On the right side, we have some categories of the items, and the bigger form, the central form, is the form that is actually not the Microsoft Access form, but this is the Microsoft Edge control, and it has some advantages because it can show some pictures like this. It is instant preview of some items, but all the content of this form is just HTML website together with some JavaScript. And most important part, all the data are put to this form from Microsoft Access. It is just given as a huge string with this execute JavaScript command. So it is not the example like it was before for the charts, because the charts was every time the charts were refreshed, it was loading brand new HTML file. But this time it is the HTML file is loaded once, but anytime we are changing something, it is actually injecting from Microsoft Access some new content to the HTML code, and the JavaScript is formatting that code. I mean, actually, there are some JSON data that are being formatted to the HTML website. So it is the way how we can extend our function and make usage of this good edge control in our Microsoft Access database. Maybe I will switch to design form somewhere here. So you will notice, all right, exactly. So this is the design form. You will notice this one is not the classical Microsoft Access form, but it is just Microsoft Edge controller. So this is the short demonstration, and all the rest of the things will be shown next presentation on 4th of February.
Thank you, Alexander. And I know a lot of people have tried and struggled with the Edge browser control to get it to do useful things. The fact that you've succeeded, I think, will be of great interest to a lot of people. So we look forward to seeing you back next month. And thank you again for coming back to us. And very pleased to see your third presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Neil or comments for Neil that haven't already been covered? Crystal, your microphone has just appeared.
Neil, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Outstanding stuff.
I was shocked at how involved it became, which is why I'd been trying to avoid it for 6 months. You know, the other thing that happened to me is that the new message box appeared in the spring and then disappeared in June. And so I was working, I did all this development work, and I still had the old message box on my system. No one could explain why mine had retrograded back to the old message box. But when I went to do this presentation and get it ready over Christmas, I had an upgrade and it all gone to the new message box. That put the cat among the pigeons a bit. And the other thing is Access actually made changes to their message box in their last release, which I discovered yesterday. So yesterday I had to do a few fixes. In fact, they changed the font they're using in the title. So I was no longer pixel perfect, but I managed to fix it in time.
Thank you. You mentioned Stephen Lebans' amazing website, and it's a great shame that he retired some years ago, but kept their websites up is great. Stephen Lebans' website is amazing. It's full of APIs. He uses APIs that I've never seen anyone else use, and it's all user interface stuff. The only problem you need to be aware of is that it's 32-bit only. So if you are trying to actually program for 64-bit, you've got a lot of work to do to convert his various different APIs. But
oh yeah, that's the modification I didn't mention. Obviously, I VBA7'd it as well.
Yeah. I just mentioned though, John Mallinson's VBE Extras will give you almost all of the API conversions that you need. There are also other things. Peter Cole has got conversion work as well. There are various ways of helping you actually manage to do the conversion work, but it is a major task. His APIs are just so extensive and in some cases obscure. It's also worth pointing out though that because he was so influential, many of the things that he's got on his website have since been introduced into Access anyway. For example, rich text and so on, but they weren't available when he wrote them. Right, we've got one new comment here, and Marcus is thanking you for keeping the pigeon alive. So I think it's a bit late. That pigeon died long ago, along with the parrot. So anyway, right. Neil, did you want to try and explain your virtual camera bit?
Yeah, is that what people would like me to show?
Yeah, I'd just like to know what you meant by that.
Right, what I've got
I could see the fuzzy, but what exactly were you doing if you weren't sharing your screen?
I've got a program called OBS Studio. It's an open source streaming program for streaming video. I use it as my call recorder. So basically, I can hit a button and it's recording my screen, my mic, my screen. It does a screen recording, and I can record meetings and so on. And one of the features is that you can get it to stream your desktop as a webcam. So what you do is you literally just turn your desktop. It's like screen sharing in Zoom. You say, take screen 2 and turn it into a webcam, and it appears as a webcam. And then you go into Zoom and say, use my OBS webcam. And what you're getting is OBS's stream of your desktop. But because it's actually streaming it rather than sharing it, you actually get all the graphics, which is why it's a bit grainy, but you've got all the shadowing and so on. So you could watch videos or anything with it.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking, all right, so maybe what you're doing is you're reducing the pixels it takes, or the bitmap it takes
I don't have to touch any
to
of that.
transmit a screen. So you're reducing that like on the fly. Whereas with Zoom, I mean, if we set it for a certain monitor size, it's not going to reduce itself. So you're streaming faster, and I can see how that could be helpful.
I think it's because Zoom and Teams and even remote desktop, what they do is they turn off certain aero effects to save bandwidth, because they're trying to stream at minimum bandwidth, and it's just they just turn them off. So if that's what you're trying to show, you can't show it. What OBS does is it literally just behaves as a camera and does a pixel copy of what's on your screen and shares it, and therefore includes all those effects. But because it's doing a pixel copy, the overall effect is a little lower resolution, a little bit more blurry. So it's not as good for presentations, but it captures things that presentations miss.
Yeah. Have you tried it with Teams, Neil?
Yes, I think I have actually.
Yeah, it's whether I just wonder whether Teams would give you better resolution than Zoom when using the virtual camera.
I think fundamentally what it is it's as far as Teams is concerned, it's just another webcam. It doesn't even know it's a virtual camera. It's just a device on the system.
Anyway, I mean, we did look in practice at using that the whole way through, but it just was too grainy. It would have given you all eye strain, and I think you wouldn't have been as impressed with the high quality of Neil's work, because you wouldn't have been able to read it all easily. Right, I need to wrap up the meeting. Thank you again to Neil for an excellent presentation. Looking forward to Aleksander next month. Thank you all for attending, and I'll see you next month.